welcome to everybody that's with us. Thanks those for being here with me in person. And those of you who are watching, know we have some watching us live right now. Thank you for tuning us in. While we've also got some going to be catching us later on. I thank you as well. Let's get started. Go back to Genesis 21, verse 15. And I want to finish up this section 15 through 21 and hopefully get started in the first few verses of chapter 22. We are nearing the middle section, middle point of the book. We're going to stop and take a break after we get through chapter 22. So we've got a few more times to meet. But anyway, let's go to Genesis 21:15, and while we're doing that, let's open ourselves up now to a word of prayer. Gracious, loving Heavenly Father, thank you so much for bringing us all together through the power of being here in person and also through the power of this internet that you blessed us with. And so just lead us all now as we are in this together. Use the power of your Spirit to open our hearts and our minds so that we can receive your word from your word tonight. And that we can grow stronger in our daily walk and our daily relationship with you and with each other. And we ask all this in your holy, mighty, and very precious name. Amen. All right, so you will join me again starting verse 15. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite of a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Haran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. All right, so the thing is, as you remember, Hagar and Ishmael have been sent off by Sarah's orders. Abraham's given them bread and a skin of water. And last week we concluded our time that, as we learned in verse 17, that God hears the voice of Ishmael. And we talked about the fact, we're asked the question, why did God only hear the voice of Ishmael? And some scholars say it's because Hagar wasn't praying, but I say it all depends on what version of the Bible you choose to look at. Some just talk about began to sob. Others versions say she lifted up her voice and then began to sob or to wail. It was just a great reminder that prayer, "God help me," is still one of the greatest, strongest prayers we can pray. But we also then concluded by talking about how others believe that God only heard Ishmael because he is the reason they're in this mess in the first place. It's his fault. Because he was mocking, playing with Isaac. And one of the things that I thought about was, why didn't Ishmael just realize Isaac's the promised one, not him? All he had to do was just step up, become his brother's best friend, his protector, and then after their father died, he would be his confidant, his number one man. And after Abraham died, if Isaac had turned on him, then all he had to do was beat him up to a pulp and then take his stuff and head on out. But instead, he doesn't do that. He mocks, he plays with him. And as a result, they're out there because it's his fault. And so they believe that what's going on here, God hears Ishmael's prayers because he's praying for forgiveness, which is once again a great reminder of who our God is, that God always hears a penitent, repentant prayer. That God not only hears, he acts on those penitent prayers. So now let's pick up with verse 17 here still. Because there's something else that also happens in this verse that still makes me believe. Just a personal belief that Hagar was praying while all this is going on. Now look again at verse 17, and we read here in this verse one thing that I believe leads us to understand Hagar was actually praying. there's a statement in verse 17 that is made concerning Hagar. Do you see what that statement is?
God called to her.
Okay, all right, very good. Now, the angel of God, the angel of the Lord, called to Hagar from heaven. So God calls to her. So the question I have is, why would God send an angel to Hagar if Ishmael is the one he heard praying? I mean, I just still have to ask that. Now, of course, some people would say, well, Brother Sam, probably by this point, Ishmael's fainted. He's passed out. And so he asked to now talk to Hagar, but personally, I like to believe it's because, once again, I still feel like she is praying at this point. But none of that really matters, okay? Because whatever the reason going on, I've always loved what the angel then says to Hagar. So what does the angel then say to her or ask Hagar at this point?
What's wrong?
Yeah, what's wrong? What's the matter? Or what troubles you, Hagar? That's what the New Revised Standard has. Now, for me, the angel is not asking Hagar what is wrong, but is seeking to remind Hagar now of what important truth?
Fear not.
Fear not. What else? Why are you troubled, Hagar? Don't you know what?
God has heard the voice.
God has heard you. That God hears you. And that means that God is also then what? That he has not only heard her voice, God is also
Going to lift him up.
going to lift him up, or you could say that. Or think about Hagar. Not only is God, God hears you, he is also with you. Which brings me to the one thought I kept going through my mind. Why do we worry about things when we tell everybody we know, yeah, I believe that God is always with us. I believe God is everywhere, that God is always with me. I wonder myself, why do I always worry? Or why do I allow worry to control me? Which is something, Sandy will tell you. I'm a worrier. I get it from my mom, bless her soul. Bless her heart. She was a worrier. I worry. The thing is, I allow worry to control me so much in my life, in spite of the fact I know what? That God has promised to be with me. Or if Jesus says, I will never what?
Leave you.
I'll never forsake you. Why do we allow worry to bother us when we tell the world God is always with us, God's everywhere? So the thing is, to me, it's just a wonderful reminder when the angel said, what's troubling you, Hagar? God has heard you. God is with you on this. Then look at verse 18 and 19. Now, once this kind of goes with what Mr. Harold was talking about there in verse 18. See, whatever's going on, it's believed, though, that in her weakened condition, that Hagar would have actually been unable to do what? To come over and do what?
Hold the kid.
Or hold him up or lift up the boy. That's why the original Hebrew text reads, Hagar helped the boy to his feet. So apparently, once again, it goes back to, well, he didn't talk to Ishmael because he's passed out. Well, he must have come to, or he never was passed out, because Hagar is now helping the boy to his feet. But now we get to verse 19. And it's in this verse, I also believe that we learn the greatest lesson of all, with all this that's going on in the story. So look again at verse 19. And all this, that's the greatest lesson, is found in the statement there. God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. Now, the question has always been this. Was the well of water always there all the time? It had been there the entire time.
Yeah, but this is in the desert, isn't it?
I know, but the thing is, did God just create this well of water for her, or was it there the entire time? Now, the belief is, and this is just a belief, that it was there. That most likely the answer is yes, that it was there. Because there are sources of water in the desert. They say that there are sources of water in that specific desert there of Beersheba. The thing is, you have to know what?
Where it's at.
Where they're at. Okay? You have to know, or more importantly, you have to know how to what? How to find it. Okay? Hagar didn't know that. Remember, she's new to this area. But there's a bigger question with a greater lesson here. The big question, or the big lesson is, why didn't Hagar see the well of water when she got there? It's believed that it was there. Why didn't she see it? Well, she didn't see it because she's too focused on what?
The boy.
On the boy, or something else. Not just the boy. The boy's part of it. But not just focused on the boy. She's focused on her what?
Her problems?
Her problems. The troubles. She is worried about her son, but she's too focused on, not just on worrying about the boy. She's also focused on her troubles. And the lesson is this, this is what happens to us in our lives when we do what?
Worry.
When we worry, but we also end up doing what? Remember what I say? She was too focused on her what?
Problem.
On her problems, on trouble. So when we choose to focus on our problems, we end up losing sight of who? God. And when you lose sight of God, you then lose your what?
Your way.
Your way. You lose your way. You also lose your what?
Will.
Your will. That's good. You lose your what? Relationship. You lose your what? My word was faith. I just was seeing how many of y'all, I just want to see what all of y'all saw, which you're all right. Wonderful answers here. When we choose to focus on the problem instead of focusing on God, that's when we lose our relationship, all the things that connect us to God. Which is a wonderful reminder. He said, what troubles you, Hagar? Don't put your eyes on your problems. Focus upon God now, okay? And why should she do this? Well, look at verses 20 and 21. Now, I want to look at these in opposite order, okay? So look at verse 21. Because as we read now, Hagar, first off, they get the water. And as a result, Hagar gets Ishmael a what? In the end, she ends up getting, in verse 21,
Why she got
a wife.
Yeah.
All right, now, she ends up getting a wife for Ishmael, which goes along with what that we talked about last week. Remember, we talked about, in verse 14, how he takes the bread and the skin of water, gives it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulders, along with what? There in verse 14?
With her child.
Along with the boy, or with the son, the child, and everything. And we talked about the fact that he's not physically putting the boy on top of the bread and the water on top of her shoulders. But Mr. Harold answered it. Do you remember your answer to it? That this actually represented what? That he was actually putting what upon her shoulders? The responsibility for doing
Or
what?
raising the boy.
For raising, of taking care of it. So this goes back. Abraham placing the responsibility for raising Ishmael now upon Hagar. And during this time, it was the custom of the father to take the responsibility to find a wife for his son. But here, in her final appearance, there in verse 21, this is the final time we read anything about Hagar, and she does what? She finds herself she finds her son a wife, which is also the only time this is written in the Old Testament. The only time it's recorded in the Old Testament is that Hagar does this for Ishmael, okay? But now go back to verse 20. Because most importantly, we are told that God now, once again, does what?
He's with the boy.
He do what?
He is with the boy.
He is with the boy. Or put it another way, he also keeps his what now?
Promise.
His promise to Ishmael. Remember back in the earlier part, or to Abraham, he promises Abraham that, Ishmael's going to be okay. I'm going to make a nation out of him. So as a result, he keeps that promise to be with Ishmael. And as a result of all this, Ishmael becomes the ancestor of the Bedouin tribes that end up living in the area of Paran. Paran was located between Canaan and Sinai. Okay, the area of Sinai. These are the ancestors of the nomadic tribes that now live in the rural areas of Saudi Arabia. But now, instead of riding camels and horses, they now ride in what?
Cadillacs and limousines.
Cadillacs, limousines, SUVs, fancy pickup trucks. They have it made now. But there's also understanding this, seeing this nation. This also then tells us the reason for what that I just mentioned at the beginning of our time together. The reason why he and Isaac could not be one. Remember what I told you? If Ishmael, instead of mocking or picking on, playing with Isaac, if he just what? Stepped up and
Be his friend.
like his confidant or whatever.
Be his friend.
Be his friend, or better yet, why they still can't, why they could not be brothers. Because Ishmael becomes the founder of the people who basically, through the Canaanites, become Israel's number one enemy. This is why Ishmael couldn't stay. It's why he mocks him and plays with him. Because this is the way I guess it was always designed to be. They would always be enemies to each other. And so here we have the end now of Ishmael and of Hagar, okay? And the story that's been going on with them. Now let's skip over to chapter 22. And join me, and I want to look at the first 8 verses. Pick up with the first 8 verses of chapter 22. One of the most well-known stories, again, found not just in Genesis, but throughout the entire Bible. Now, after these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. All right, so let's pick up with this one now. There in verse 1. Now I'm going to tell you right off the bat, there are 3 things in the opening words of this verse that I want us to take a look at. And you may be thinking to yourself, here what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, about 15, 16 words. How can there be 3 things for us to look at in such a short verse and everything? But I want to take the time to kind of look at some of these things. There's 3 things I want us to look at. First off, they're in the opening words of this verse. Now, we are not sure how much time has actually passed between Ishmael being sent away and this point of the story. The New Revised Standard says, after these things. The NIV has sometime later. Anybody got anything different than these 2? After these things or sometime later? Well, the thing is, like I said, we don't know exactly how much time. This could mean it'd be months to years have now passed between the 2 moments. But there is one thing there in verse 5 that might shed some light on how much time has passed. It's how Isaac referred to in verse 5 as what?
Young.
As young. Anybody got anything different?
Boy.
The boy. That's more along with the original text there. He was young, or he was the boy. Now, the Hebrew words used here refer to a young person who is yet to be seen as a man. Now, we last left Isaac, just being weaned, maybe 2 to 6 years old. He is still considered, though, to be a boy, so he could be, on up into his early teens at this point. So we don't really know how much time has happened. But the bottom line, once again, a timeline that we've always talked about isn't something that should really concern us, when it comes to all this within the Bible. Because the truth is, even though he's called the boy, Hebrew tradition has always said that he was 37 years old at that point. Now, that might still be considered a boy back in then, especially if you're living to be 200 years old. You're still a child at 37. But also this, there's the well-known, much-respected Jewish historian Josephus. Josephus kept excellent records of the history of the Jewish people. He says Isaac was actually 20 years old at the time. So we really don't know how old he is or really what's going on here. And I share this because, like I said, once again, don't let timelines confuse you or anything. It's more about what is going on here. Which then brings us to the second thing about verse 1 I want us to talk about. For me, this is the most important part of the verse. It's where we're told that God does what?
Tested Abraham.
Okay, God tested Abraham. Now, once again, you know how I feel about this word and feel about this. I believe that God does not test us so that he can find out things about us. I've always said, God already knows everything about us, so why would he have a need to do what? To test us. God already knows. And see, for me, if we say God tests us to find out something about us, then that means we are doing what to God's power, or what to who God is.
It would diminish.
We're diminishing it. We're limiting God's power. If you say, well, God has to test us to find out, then that means God does not know what?
Doesn't know what's going to happen.
He didn't know something. That means he didn't know everything. But once again, we are told that God tested Abraham. Now, this has always gone back in my face by people who just like to do that.
Well, but what means of a test?
Well,
it could be a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It could be, a test isn't, I don't believe you're going to do this. Let me see you do it. It could be putting him in a position to see what he would do on his own.
All right? And that's a good thought. So hang on to that. Now, Papa, we'll come back to you. That's a good way of looking at it. Because like I said, this is what people like to point out when I say I don't believe that God tests us. That God got up one morning and said, I'm going to test Sam Burton and see what he does. Whether it's in a conversation or what.
But if he does test us, it's not so he'll see where we are, it's so we'll see where we are.
All right, that's where I'm going.
Very
Which
good.
is fine. That's fine. That's no problem whatsoever. You see, the thing is this. To help us understand what this means, we have to ask the right question. All right? To help us understand, the right question, first off, is not, since God already knew everything about Abraham, then why did he have to test him? The question that we must ask is this, that since God already knew everything about Abraham, then who would this test really be for? Okay? And this is what she was talking about. You see, Dr. Wilbur Williams, he's the guy that authored the Wesleyan book that I have been using on this. He's the main source of information. He talks about being a professor for many years. He's given thousands of tests over the years. And he says that he gives tests for two reasons. First off, his personal knowledge of how much a student knows is what?
Limited.
It's limited. His knowledge is limited because he's a human being. So he gives a test to find out how much the students know. But he also gives the test for a second reason, so that the student can discover what?
How much they know.
How much they know, or what? What's the other thing they learn? Not just how much they know,
How
but
much they need to learn.
how much they need to learn, or let's put it like this, how much they do not know. You see, that's why there are tests. Dr. Williams points out that God is not limited with his knowledge about anything, which especially includes you and me. So when God tested Abraham, the test was not for God to find out, how much he knew about Abraham or what Abraham knew. The test was able to help do what now? Like Beth Ellen just said. It's about what? Beth Ellen? It's about what? You said it.
So he'll know.
So he'll know.
Abraham would know.
So Abraham will know what either he knows or what he doesn't know. Or to put it like this, the test is to help Abraham find out how much he knows about what three things. There are three specific things that, God wants Abraham to discover of what he knows and what he doesn't know. What could be those three? His first is what?
To find out how much God loves him.
All right, well, I hadn't thought about that one, but so he can learn how much God does love him. But what about more on a personal level with Abraham? So that Abraham can learn about his what?
Faith.
His faith. How about, what's the second one? His what?
Trust.
His trust. But what would then be the third one? And I think you said it
God
already.
keeps his word.
Okay, God keeps his word. That's not the other one I was looking for. But you're right, that God keeps his word. But he learns also about who? Not just God, but he learns about who?
Abraham.
Okay, Abram, about himself. That's what I kind of wanted. That's what I was wanting to go back to with you, because you talked about that, how he learns about himself with this. You see, Dr. Williams puts it this way: God wants Abraham to do three things: to see, to learn, and to discover. What is the main object of his true what? Of his true knowledge of God, maybe. Or maybe where his true spiritual loyalties lie. Do I really have faith? Do I really trust in God? Is this who I really am? That's why for me, like I said, it's never been about the word test. I don't like the word test. I've always liked the word opportunity. That God gives us opportunities, or maybe not gives, he allows opportunities to come so that we can learn about our faith, our trust, learn about ourselves, and hopefully what? Grow in our relationship with him. So the thing is like Beth Allen was saying, it's all about Abraham learning about himself. That's why he is being tested. But there's also a third thing in this, which to me is, okay, the second one's the most important. The third one is the biggest one of all. Because it's also in verse 3 that we now learn who it is that is talking to Abraham. We need to understand specifically, who it is. We learn how God specifically reveals himself to Abraham. Now, to understand this, there's something you need to know about the name Elohim. All right, we all know the name Elohim. We've got it connected to God. Unfortunately, there's something about Elohim that's not always revealed to us in our translations of today. You see, in the Hebrew language, that name Elohim can be used not only as a name for God, it can also be used as a name for who? Who do you think?
Satan.
Huh?
Satan.
Well, Satan. Or basically for pagan gods. Or for false gods. Okay? Elohim can also be a reference to this. Now, why would it be important for Abraham to know that this is God and not some pagan false god that's telling him to sacrifice his son Isaac? Why do you think?
He needs to know that it's coming from God because that's his only son.
Okay, that's God, that's his only son. That's true. But see, remember, this was the time of Abraham. Back in Abraham's time, child sacrifice was a very common practice among the pagan people, especially among what group of people, do you think? Who is Ishmael connected to? The Canaanites, thank you. The Canaanite people. See, these Canaanites, they would sacrifice their children first off in an attempt to pacify or satisfy fertility gods. And not what you might think. This was more about receiving the right amount of rain and sunshine so that they would have what? Good crops. The crops would be good. Now, in the area that all of this takes place, skeletal remains of children, ranging in all ages, have been discovered in various archaeological digs. That Dr. Williams, who is our main source, he talks about how he has personally seen all this, discovered these burial sites in archaeological digs that he has overseen, that he was in charge of. But it wasn't just that. It was also common for children to be sacrificed to their gods, and then they would be buried under the foundations of walls, or buried under the foundations of buildings, entire buildings. And they did this hoping, they believed that the sacrificed bodies of these children would keep these buildings from collapsing when an earthquake might come, or maybe a tornado or other natural disasters that would be brought on. When what would happen? These so-called gods would get what? Angry at them for something they had done. Well, they sacrificed these children. They're supposed to be there to help hold up the building. You see, all of this has been discovered due to burial sites. But there are two specific sites that Dr. Williams talked about. The first one, there was a discovery of one burial site that was intentionally put there. The ground, this chamber had been dug, and they put the bodies of the children, and it was just wide enough then for the wall to be then covered up, and then this wall was built directly above it. Okay? But there were also several children's burial sites they found beneath this 4-inch courtyard foundation of this rather large home, maybe a palace. And not only was that built, but there, right off adjacent to that, was another room that also had children buried up to underneath it. And the skeletal remains there, they were from ages 3 months to teenagers. Of these skeletal remains of children that were there. Now, I don't mean to upset anybody with this, but it's important that you know. Because in the original Hebrew writings, the author wants his readers, he wanted the Hebrews to know, wants us to know, that this was not some pagan god calling Abraham to do something that everybody did. Okay, already did. He wants us to know, them to know, that this was truly God, Jehovah, Yahweh, who is the one who's calling Abraham to make this sacrifice, not one of these false gods. And Moses does this back in the original text. He makes sure that we know that this is God, Elohim, because when he writes it, he makes sure to use this little small 3-letter word. What 3-letter word do you think that Moses used there in front of the name Elohim to indicate that this was truly God? We use it every little article, small article, 3-letter word. The, thank you, ma'am. It's the word the. He makes sure to use that word the. You see, in chapter 22, verse 1, a lot of times it's simply being translated, it'll read, tested God Abraham. But that's not right. The true translation here should actually be, The God, He tested Abraham. The God. You see, Moses specifically adds this article "the," so that his readers will know that this is not some pagan god calling Abraham to do this, okay? But that this call of sacrifice was actually from the one true God Himself. And so we know that the author, Moses, does this so that we will know who it is that is calling Abraham. But they also ask, what could be another reason, though, why Moses wants his readers to know that it was specifically God Himself making this call? Not just to make sure that He is being kept separate, that He's not being confused with these pagan gods. But this is God Himself doing it because it begins to show the people what? Concerning sacrifice. It begins to open up the door to show the true importance of what sacrifice should be. You see, sacrifice, no matter what kind of sacrifice it is, should be more than just going through the motions kind of thing. See, God is beginning to teach the Hebrew people that sacrifice is supposed to have what? Meaning and what? How about purpose behind it? What else in our time with God should also have meaning and purpose and not just be going through the motions?
Prayer.
Prayer, and what else for us? How about worship? That's what worship should also be for us. There should be a meaning and a purpose. Sometimes we just make it going through the motions. And worship, just like sacrifice, is supposed to be much more than that. Okay? So why don't we stop here, because it's already after 6:35. I was hoping to get into verse 2 and 3 on this, but we'll pick up next week. And like I said, our goal is to work our way on through this to at least the end of verse 19, and then we're going to stop. And we're going to kind of put a halt on our study, and we're going to start a new study on the book of Romans. So we'll be going to that in a couple of weeks. But let's stop here right now. Hopefully we'll finish everything up next week. And then we'll be starting Romans in 2 weeks. So anyway, thank you so much for being here with me today. Those of you who are watching us here on Facebook and YouTube, take care. Have a blessed rest of the week, and goodbye.